The courtroom was completely silent. The judge's gavel rang out, announcing the verdict that had shattered the life of Ricardo Silva. A decorated police officer with 15 years of service, Ricardo sat handcuffed, staring at the floor. Despite his repeated claims of innocence, the jury had ruled against him. The evidence he was certain had been planted was enough to send him to jail, but the weight of the sentence wasn't what crushed him the most. It was the knowledge that he would have to leave Thor behind, his faithful partner, K9. Thor sat near the back of the courtroom, his watchful gaze fixed on Ricardo. The German Shepherd was more than a partner. He had been Ricardo's constant companion in moments of life and death. Now, as Ricardo faced the lowest point of his life, the thought of never seeing Thor again was unbearable. As the judge stood to leave, Ricardo's voice broke through the tense silence. "Your Honor," he said, his voice breaking, "before I am taken away, I have one last request. Please let me say goodbye to Thor." Quote, the courtroom murmured in surprise. The judge paused, studying Richard for a long moment. Finally he nodded, his voice firm but understanding. "Tutos," he said. As soon as Thor was released, the dog ran towards Richard, his claws clicking loudly on the floor. Richard fell to his knees, pulling Thor into a tight hug. "I'm sorry, buddy," Richard whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I let you down. I won't be here anymore." Thor whimpered, nuzzling into Richard's chest. But then something changed. Thor's body stiffened and his nose began working frantically against Richard's jacket. He tugged at the fabric with a sharp bark. The sudden sound shattered the solemnity of the courtroom, drawing all eyes. "What is the dog doing?" the judge asked, frowning. Thor pulled harder, his high-pitched barks echoing off the walls. One of the officers cautiously stepped forward and began checking Ricardo's jacket. The tension in the room became suffocating. Then, with a metallic clink, a small object fell to the floor. It was a recording device. The prosecutor's face went pale. He stepped forward quickly. His voice trembled. "This doesn't prove anything," he snapped, trying to regain control of the moment, but Thor barked again. His alert posture unwavering. The truth was clear. Whatever was on that device mattered. Ricardo stared at the small recorder, his heart pounding. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered. Could this be the proof he'd been waiting for? Did you feel the power of the bond between Ricardo and Thor? Imagine what's yet to come in this gripping story. If you want to find out what's on that recorder and how it could change everything, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. The next exciting moment is just beginning. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. The small recording device sat in the center of the floor, its metal casing gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Thor stood rigidly beside Ricardo, his piercing barks piercing the room as if demanding attention. All eyes turned to the object, and the air grew thick with tension. "Take this," the judge ordered, his voice low but firm. The officer closest to the device hesitated for a moment before bending down and picking it up in his hand. He held it up for all to see, confusion etched on his face. "What is this?" the judge asked sharply, directing his gaze to the prosecutor, who was already beginning to sweat. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his face pale. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. It is not part of the evidence presented during the trial." He stammered clearly. "It has been tampered with." "Tampered with?" the judge interrupted. His eyebrows drew together in a courtroom. "During the trial." His voice held a sharp edge now, and the prosecutor visibly flinched. "Officer, activate the device." The officer fumbled with the small recorder. His fingers trembled as he pressed the play button. A static-filled crackle filled the room, followed by muffled voices. Everyone leaned forward, straining to hear, and then the words hit like a bomb. "Just plant the evidence," a raspy voice said, clear as day. "No one will question it. Silva's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat. Execute." Screams and screams tore through the room. Ricardo's heart stopped, then began to pound furiously. He knew that voice. It belonged to someone he had trusted. His former supervisor, Captain Raul Nunes. "That's enough." The prosecutor took off running toward the officer holding the recorder, but the judge slammed his gavel. "Sit down," he ordered, his tone so commanding that the prosecutor froze in mid-step. Ricardo couldn't believe what he was hearing. The damning recording revealed everything. How the evidence had been planted, how he had been framed. Thor, still sitting calmly beside Richard, let out a single low growl, as if echoing his partner's silent fury. The judge sat back in his chair, his expression grim. "This trial is not over," he said firmly, addressing the room. "Bailiffs, escort the defendant back to his cell. Officers, secure this device as new evidence. We are reopening this case." For the first time in weeks, Ricardo felt a glimmer of hope as he was led away. Toro watched him go, his intelligent eyes full of loyalty, and Ricardo turned to take one last look at his partner, silently promising himself and Thor that he would not let this injustice go unpunished. Back in the cold cell, Ricardo sat on the hard bench, staring at the blank concrete wall. His mind raced with everything that had just happened. Thor's keen instincts had discovered what no one else had, the proof of a setup. That recording was his lifeline. But the revelation was not just a relief, it was a betrayal. Captain Raul Nunes, the man who had mentored him for years, was behind this. Ricardo clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. How deep could this betrayal go? How far would it go? Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers, tensions were high. The judge sat at his desk, playing the recording on a secure device. The voices were unmistakable. Captain Nunes's commanding tone, combined with another voice Ricardo didn't recognize, spoke of calculated conspiracy. The judge's eyes narrowed. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Get Captain Nunes to my chambers immediately," he said curtly. Outside the courtroom, Nunes was waiting to make sure Ricardo's sentencing went smoothly, at least for his plan. But when the bailiff approached him at the judge's sudden summons, a flash of discomfort crossed his face. He stood stiffly, adjusting his tie, and followed the bailiff down the hallway. Inside the chambers, the judge's expression was unreadable. When Nunes entered, the captain offered a polite nod, but his shoulders were tense. "Did you call me, Your Honor?" Nunes asked, his voice firm, though his eyes flicked nervously to the recording device on the table. "Did I?" The judge replied, leaning forward. He tapped the recorder with his finger. "Would you like to explain that?" Nunes's confident facade wavered for a second, but he quickly masked it with confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor," he said evenly. The judge pressed play once more. The damning words filled the room. Nunes's face drained of color, but he quickly recovered. "Your Honor, that's absurd," Nunes said, forcing a laugh. "It could be anyone. Can't you seriously believe it?" "I don't believe it." The judge interrupted. "Your Honor, I act on evidence. And this?" He gestured to the recorder. "It's evidence of a crime. Several crimes, actually. And..." Before Nunes could respond, two bailiffs entered the room. Panic flashed in their eyes as they approached him. "What are you doing?" Nunes demanded, his voice rising. "You are being held for questioning," the judge said firmly. "Until we get to the bottom of this. You are suspected of obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence." As the bailiffs led the protesting Nunes away, the judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The web of corruption was unraveling quickly, and the story of Ricardo Silva was far from over. The discovery of the recording had thrown the entire department into turmoil. As Captain Nunes was taken into custody, whispers of corruption spread like wildfire among the officers. Meanwhile, Ricardo sat in his cell, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. His thoughts were focused on Thor. The faithful K9 had been the one to discover the device, and now, Ricardo couldn't help but wonder if Thor might find what else he could expose. Elsewhere, Thor was taken to the department's K9 unit for evaluation. Officer Sarah Martins, one of Ricardo's closest colleagues, volunteered to take care of the dog until the case was solved. Thor seemed restless, pacing back and forth in his kennel and occasionally letting out high-pitched barks that echoed through the otherwise silent building. "He knows something's wrong," Sarah muttered. She watched him from outside the kennel. She crouched down, looking Thor in the eye. "Don't worry, buddy. We'll figure this out." But when Sarah stood up, her gaze shifted to Thor's nose, where he was pressed against the gate, sniffing her jacket intently. Her stomach churned. Was this behavior connected to Ricardo's case, or was she imagining things? She hesitated for a moment before opening the kennel door. "You okay, kiddo?" she said, taking Thor's leash. "Let's see if you're trying to tell us something." She led Thor to Ricardo's locker in the department's storage room. The dog immediately began sniffing and pawing at the bottom of the compartment. Sarah's heart raced as she unlocked it and opened the door. Inside, beneath some folded uniforms, was a small, unmarked envelope. Her hands shook as she pulled it out and opened it. Inside were grainy but damning photographs. They showed a man, clearly Captain Nunes, meeting with a known criminal. A document tucked behind the photos described transactions that implicated Nunes in a bribery scheme tied to the very case that had led to Ricardo's arrest. Sarah stared at the evidence, her chest tightening. "Tor," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "You just found the smoking gun." Realizing the magnitude of what she was holding, Sarah immediately contacted the judge's office. The photos and documents combined with the recording Thor had uncovered painted a clear picture of Nunes's guilt. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. If Nunes had orchestrated this setup, he probably hadn't done it alone. Thor sat beside her, his steady presence supporting her as her mind raced. "Ricardo was right," she said softly, scratching Thor behind the ears. "You really are the best partner anyone could ask for." Sarah sat in the evidence room, the incriminating photos spread out on the table in front of her. The weight of what she had discovered pressed down on her chest. Captain Nunes was not just a corrupt official, he was part of something much bigger. The documents Thor had helped uncover outlined connections to other high-ranking officials, payments that could not be explained, and a disturbing trail of manipulation that went far beyond Ricardo's case. She glanced at Thor, who stood alertly beside her. His piercing eyes seemed to sense her discomfort. "It's not just about Ricardo," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "This goes much deeper." Realizing the gravity of the situation, Sarah called the judge directly. Within an hour, the evidence she had uncovered was in her hands. The judge's face darkened as he reviewed the documents and photos. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted, his voice heavy. "If these documents are correct, Ricardo Silva is not only innocent. He is the victim of a department-wide cover-up." The judge immediately ordered an emergency hearing. News of the case being reopened sent shockwaves through the precinct. Officers whispered in the hallways. Tensions rose as suspicions grew. Several officers who had testified against Ricardo began to squirm, knowing that their involvement might be investigated. Back in his cell, Ricardo was unexpectedly called in. The sudden commotion, a previous investigation into organized crime that had been buried for years. The documents were yellowed with age, and Ricardo could hardly believe his eyes as he flipped through the papers. This was what they needed. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a name that appeared repeatedly in the records. "This could be the missing link," Sarah replied, her eyes widening in realization. Ricardo's heart raced as he considered the implications. By connecting the dots between this investigation and the ongoing corruption within the department, they might finally have what they needed to bring down the entire network. "Thor, good boy," Ricardo praised, ruffling the dog's fur. The mood in the room changed from uncertainty to cautious optimism. This changed everything, but everyone knew the risks involved. Pushing any further would put everyone in danger, especially considering the powerful people they were now up against. "We need to proceed with caution," Ricardo warned, his mind racing with strategies. "If we release this too soon, we might alert them." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. Quote, "We must analyze these files thoroughly and see what connections we can make before calling attention to them." As they delved deeper into the old case files, it became clear that they were sitting on a gold mine of evidence. Every name and detail was a piece of a larger puzzle that painted a picture of a corrupt system, one that was willing to do anything to protect itself. In that moment, determination set in within Ricardo. This was no longer just about his freedom, it was about justice for all those who had been wronged. He looked to Thor, whose presence was a constant reminder of the good that still remained in the world. Together, they would fight to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Case closed. 5 years ago, a drug raid had allegedly resulted in a wave of arrests. But as Ricardo leafed through the documents, he noticed glaring inconsistencies. Names had been blacked out, and some sections of the reports had been redacted. This doesn't make sense, Ricardo muttered. These aren't standard redactions. Someone altered these files. Sarah leaned over his shoulder. Look at this, she said, pointing to a handwritten note at the bottom of a report. It was signed by Captain Nunes. The drug raid had been the perfect cover, but the evidence in the box suggested the raid had been a smokescreen to eliminate rivals in the drug trade while protecting certain criminals who were bribing the department. Ricardo clenched his fists. They were playing Endo both ways, he said, anger in his voice, and ruining the lives of good cops to do it. As they continued to review the files, Ricardo's cell phone rang. It was a message from an anonymous number. You guys are digging too deep. Stop or you'll regret it. Quote, he stared at the screen for a long moment before showing it to Sarah. She looked at him, her face pale but determined. They're scared, she said. That means we're getting close. Ricardo looked at Thor, who was sitting calmly beside him, as if ready for whatever came next. Let them come, he said. We're not stopping now. Ricardo looked at the message on his phone. You're digging too deep. Stop or you'll regret this. The message sent a chill through him. It wasn't just a vague warning, it was a direct threat. He showed it to Sarah, who leaned across the table, her expression grim. This isn't random, she said quietly. They know exactly what we're working on. They're watching us. Her words hung heavy in the air, the weight of their situation settling in. As the rest of the team left for the night, Ricardo and Sarah stayed behind, determined to figure out the missing piece of the puzzle. Thor lay at Ricardo's feet, his ear twitching occasionally as he rested. We're close, but we're still missing the key, Sarah said, scanning the files. She pointed to a document Ricardo hadn't noticed before. Look at this. Every major bribe and deleted report is tied to one name, RF. They're the ones pulling the strings. Ricardo's eyes narrowed as he stared at the initials. RF, he muttered. They'd kept themselves hidden for so long, but if we find them, this whole operation falls apart. Suddenly, Thor stood up. His body tensed, his ears snapping forward as he let out a low growl. Ricardo looked at him in alarm. What is it, boy? He asked. But before Sarah could answer, the lights in the conference room flickered and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. This isn't a power outage, she said, her voice low and steady. The sound of breaking glass broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable thud of footsteps outside the door. Ricardo's heart raced as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He motioned for Sarah to hide. We're not alone, he whispered. Thor crouched low, his growl deepening, his eyes alert, fixed on the door. Whoever had sent the message wasn't bluffing. They'd come to stop the investigation. The footsteps grew louder, getting closer. Ricardo gripped his gun tightly, his mind racing with possibilities. Stay close, Thor, he whispered. Sarah locked eyes with him, her expression resolute. No matter what happens, she said. We won't let them win. As the door opened, Thor leapt forward, his instincts sharp and ready. Ricardo steadied his aim, prepared for whatever was about to burst through that door. They were under attack, and the fight to expose the truth had turned deadly. The door opened, and chaos erupted. In an instant, a shadowy figure burst into the room, his weapon drawn. Before they could react, Thor lunged forward with incredible speed, clamping his jaws around the intruder's arm. The man let out a guttural scream, dropping his weapon as he tried to shake off the dog. Ricardo didn't hesitate. He knocked the gun away with his foot and aimed his own at the second figure now rushing through the door. Don't move, Ricardo shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The second intruder froze, his hands raised, but the attention to their posture told him they were waiting for an opportunity to strike. Behind him, Sarah had hidden and was calling for backup on her radio. Her voice firm but urgent. Thor held the first man steady, growling low as the intruder struggled. Tell him to come out, the man shouted in panic. Ricardo stepped forward, his gun steady. Tell him to come out first, he snapped, gesturing to the others outside. He could hear more footsteps echoing down the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Whoever these people were, they had not come to negotiate. The man didn't answer, but before Ricardo could press further, another deafening sound filled the air. Canisters of tear gas were thrown into the room. Thick, acrid smoke began to fill the space, stinging his eyes and throat. "We're out of time," Sarah shouted, reaching for the files they had been working on. "We need to move." Ricardo hissed sharply, and Thor immediately released his grip on the man's arm, retreating back to Ricardo's side. The team moved quickly, ducking to avoid the gas as they headed for the emergency exit at the back of the room. Gunfire rang out behind them. Bullets ricocheted off the unmoving walls. Ricardo could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he covered Sarah and Thor, firing back to slow their pursuers. Stepping out the exit, they found themselves in the dark alley behind the building. Sarah clutched the files to her chest, gasping for air. "We can't go back to the precinct," she said between breaths. "They've compromised everything. They'll be waiting for us." Ricardo nodded. Whoever RF was, he was running. They were playing for keeps. But as he looked at Thor, who stood beside him panting but unfazed, Ricardo felt a surge of resolve. "Then we'll end this on our terms," he said. "We're not running anymore." The safe house was eerily quiet. Ricardo, Sarah, and Thor had taken refuge there after narrowly escaping the attack on the district. The small cabin, hidden deep in the woods, was their last refuge. Spread out across the wooden table in front of it were the files Sarah had managed to salvage. They contained everything they needed to expose the network, transaction records, names and connections to RF, the shadowy figure who had orchestrated it all. Sarah flipped through the files, her fingers shaking slightly. "That's it," she said. "If we get this to the press or the federal investigators, they won't be able to cover it up. The whole operation will fall apart." Ricardo nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the window, scanning the tree line. He knew it wasn't over. Whoever had attacked them wouldn't stop until they were silenced. Suddenly, Thor's ears perked up and he let out a low growl, his body tensing. Ricardo froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. "They found us," he whispered. Sarah looked up, her face pale but determined. "How? We were careful." Ricardo shook his head. "It doesn't matter, they're here." The first shot shattered the stillness, piercing the cabin window. Glass scattered across the room as Ricardo pushed Sarah behind the desk for cover. Thor barked furiously, holding his position beside Ricardo. More shots rang out, the attackers closing in. Ricardo took a deep breath, adrenaline flooding his veins. "Stay down," he told Sarah. "Thor and I will stop them." He and Thor moved in perfect sync as the attackers broke through the front door. Ricardo fired, knocking one of the intruders down. Thor lunged at another. His powerful jaws brought the man to the ground, but the attackers kept coming. Sarah crawled toward the filing cabinets, grabbing the most important documents and stuffing them into a bag. "Ricardo," she shouted over the gunfire. "We need to get this out of here now." Ricardo nodded, his face grim. "Go ahead, Thor and I will cover her." Sarah hesitated for a second before slipping out the back door, disappearing into the darkness with the evidence in hand. Ricardo and Thor held their ground, repelling the attackers with all their might. As the last intruder fell, sirens rang in the distance. Reinforcements had finally arrived. Days later, the story broke across the country. Sarah had turned the files over to a trusted journalist, and the resulting exposure brought down the entire network. Arrests were made at every level, from corrupt cops to RF himself, who turned out to be a powerful local politician who had been using the police department as his personal enforcers. Ricardo was hailed as a hero, though he ignored the attention. Standing on the porch of his home, he watched Thor play in the backyard. The loyal dog had saved him more times than he could count, and their bond had become unbreakable. "We did it, kid," Richard said softly, kneeling down to scratch Thor behind the ears. "It's over." Thor wagged his tail, nuzzling into Richard's touch. His eyes were alert, calm for the first time in weeks. For Richard, this wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of something new. He had fought for justice, not just for himself, but for the people who had been silenced and betrayed. And as he watched Thor chase a ball into the golden light of the setting sun, he knew they had earned this moment of peace. What an incredible story, right? If this touched your heart, send a big thank you. Click the icon below the video. Choose your favorite sticker, set the amount, and confirm your support. This helps us bring you more heartwarming stories. Thank you for being with us.